It started as a normal Saturday morning in the quiet cul-de-sac of Willow Bend Estates, a neighborhood that prided itself on uniform lawns, pastel-colored houses, and mailboxes that all stood precisely 3 feet from the curb. For years, the peace of this meticulously controlled community had been guarded by the self-appointed queen of the HOA, Karen Whitmore. She was the type of person who believed her clipboard held divine authority, her word law, and her will absolute. For most residents, it was easier to comply than to resist. They trimmed their hedges twice a week, parked their cars in their garages, and never dared paint their fences without written permission. But I wasn't most residents. My name's Tom Hargrove, and I'd bought my property on the far edge of the subdivision precisely because it bordered open farmland, a boundary between the HOA's kingdom of conformity and the real world where common sense still existed. For the first year, Karen left me mostly alone. Maybe she thought I was harmless, or maybe she was too busy enforcing rules about trash cans and Christmas lights. But everything changed the day I decided to park my tractor on my own property. To her, the sight of it, a big red Massey Ferguson, perfectly clean and neatly parked on gravel, was an unforgivable sin against her carefully curated image of suburban perfection. At first it started with the notes, little white slips tucked under my windshield wiper. This vehicle is in violation of HOA Code 7B, Section 3, prohibited machinery visible from street. I ignored them. My land wasn't just part of the HOA. Half of it predated the entire development. But Karen didn't care about legal boundaries, only aesthetic ones. Then came the emails. Then the threats of fines. When I still didn't move it, she escalated. She started parking her black SUV, an enormous, shiny monstrosity of chrome and arrogance, right at the edge of my driveway. At first I thought it was coincidence. Then she began parking closer. Day after day, she'd leave it there, half blocking my exit, daring me to do something about it. The other neighbors noticed, of course, but no one said anything. No one ever did. Karen had a reputation for turning neighbors against each other, filing anonymous complaints, and rallying the HOA board with her signature weapon, righteous indignation. One morning, I woke to find her SUV parked not just near my driveway but completely across it, nose to tail, blocking me entirely. Her vehicle gleamed under the morning sun, angled in just the right way that I couldn't pull out even if I wanted to. On the windshield, a handwritten note read, "Per HOA regulation, non-compliant property vehicles will be subject to removal until the issue is resolved." I remember standing there in disbelief, coffee cup in hand, staring at the audacity of it. She'd effectively held my own property hostage, and the HOA board predictably backed her up when I called. They said they'd look into it, which everyone knew meant they wouldn't. That was the moment something inside me snapped. See, I wasn't a man who liked drama. I worked hard, paid my dues, and kept to myself. But when someone blocks your driveway on your own land, it stops being about rules. It becomes about principle. So I made a decision. I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to call the police. I wasn't even going to tow her car. No, I was going to solve this the country way. Quietly, efficiently, and with a touch of poetic justice. I went back inside, finished my coffee, and let the plan form. Out in the barn sat my pride and joy, the same red tractor Karen had declared war on. Big, powerful, and fitted with a front loader that could move half a ton of dirt in one scoop. I'd used it for hauling hay and clearing brush, but that morning I realized it was about to have a new purpose. All morning, I worked calmly on my land. I fixed a fence post, mowed the edge of the field, and pretended not to notice her SUV gleaming smugly at the edge of my property. Every so often, I'd see her from her porch, sipping her coffee, clipboard in hand, probably congratulating herself for putting the rebel neighbor in his place. By early afternoon, the air was thick and still. I climbed onto my tractor, started the engine, and let it idle. The deep growl of its diesel engine rolled through the air, echoing across the cul-de-sac. Curtains twitched. Heads turned. Karen stepped outside, curious. I didn't look at her. I simply eased the tractor forward, slow and deliberate, toward my blocked driveway. The front loader gleamed in the sun. The engine roared louder as I closed the distance. Karen shouted something, but I couldn't hear her over the machine. I lined up the loader with the SUV's rear bumper, and with a flick of the lever, lifted. The massive vehicle groaned as its back wheels lifted clear off the pavement. The neighbors gasped. Karen screamed. And before she could do anything more than shriek about property destruction, I rolled forward, just far enough to tilt the entire SUV backward into the shallow ditch beside the road. It wasn't a hard drop, just enough to make a statement. The SUV landed with a thud, half tilted, its rear end buried in the soft mud. I turned off the tractor and sat there for a moment, letting the silence sink in. Birds chirped. A lawnmower buzzed in the distance. Karen stood frozen, clutching her clipboard like a shield. For the first time in years, the queen of the HOA had been dethroned, if only for a moment. When the police arrived an hour later, she was hysterical. But to their credit, they listened to my side of the story. When I pointed out the property line, complete with the survey markers showing the SUV was fully on my land, they nodded. They told her it was a civil matter, not criminal. That night, the entire neighborhood buzzed with whispers. Some called me reckless, others called me a hero. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly. As I looked out at the SUV still sitting in the ditch under the glow of the streetlight, I could almost feel the storm brewing. This wasn't the end of the fight. It was just the beginning. The morning after the incident, the cul-de-sac felt eerily quiet, the kind of silence that comes right before a storm hits. The SUV still sat where I'd left it. Rear tires buried deep in the ditch, mud streaked along its glossy black paint. Karen's porch light had stayed on all night, burning like a beacon of fury. By sunrise, the neighborhood's peace had been replaced by whispers and nervous glances. Neighbors walked their dogs a little slower that morning, lingering just long enough to take a peek at the spectacle, but never long enough to make eye contact with me. No one dared to speak openly about it, but everyone knew what had happened. The story had spread faster than wildfire. Karen had called every HOA board member before the sun was up. Her SUV, being assaulted by a rogue resident, had, in her mind, crossed a line so severe that the very sanctity of Willow Bend Estates was now under threat. And of course, in classic HOA fashion, she twisted every fact to fit her narrative. In her version, I was a violent, unhinged man who had used heavy machinery to endanger property and life. By mid-morning, I could hear the distant hum of an approaching vehicle. It wasn't a tow truck, it was worse. A white SUV with the HOA's logo printed on the door pulled up, followed by 2 board members and a clipboard in hand. They didn't say a word to me. They simply walked around my property, snapping photos like investigators at a crime scene. They measured distances, took notes, and muttered among themselves as if preparing for trial. Within hours, an email hit my inbox. The subject line read, "Formal notice of violation and pending. Fines." The letter accused me of reckless endangerment, destruction of HOA member property, and breach of neighborhood conduct. They were demanding I pay a fine of $5,000 and attend a mandatory hearing before the HOA board to determine the continuation of residency privileges. I almost laughed when I read that phrase. Continuation of residency privileges. The audacity of an HOA to act like they could evict someone from their own land never ceased to amaze me. But I didn't laugh for long, because beneath the absurdity was something serious. The HOA had power, especially in a neighborhood where most people feared confrontation. Karen was using that power like a weapon, and now she was coming for me with everything she had. The SUV was eventually towed out of the ditch by late afternoon. 2 men from a local towing company spent over an hour winching it back onto the pavement while Karen stood nearby, her arms crossed, glaring at me from across the street. Every scrape and groan of the metal against mud sounded like a warning bell. After the tow truck left, she made her next move. A new notice appeared on my mailbox that evening, this one hand-delivered, printed on official HOA letterhead. It stated that I was under investigation for repeated non-compliance and that my use of industrial machinery on residential property was strictly prohibited. It even demanded that I cease and desist all use of agricultural or mechanical equipment within HOA view. In other words, she was trying to ban my tractor. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about a parking dispute anymore. Karen was waging a full-blown war. Over the next few days, things escalated fast. Mysteriously, I started receiving code violation notices for absurd reasons. Mailbox paint fading, fence post misalignment, grass exceeding 2.5 inches. Every one of them came with a fine attached, and every one of them conveniently had Karen's signature. I'd lived through bureaucracy before, but this was different. It wasn't about fairness or neighborhood standards. It was personal. She was trying to break me down, inch by inch, until I gave up and sold the house. That was her playbook. I'd seen her do it before to others. The Johnsons, who had dared to install a backyard shed without her approval. The Parkers, who painted their shutters off-white instead of cloud white. Both families moved away within a year. But I wasn't going anywhere. Each morning I made a point of starting my tractor up. Loud, proud, and visible from every house on the street. I didn't even need to use it. I'd just let it idle while I worked in the barn or checked fence lines. It was my silent message to her. This machine isn't leaving, and neither am I. By the end of the week, the HOA hearing date was set. It would be held in the community clubhouse, a sterile beige building that smelled like stale coffee and passive aggression. I'd seen those meetings before. Karen at the head of the table, surrounded by board members who nodded at everything she said like bobbleheads in business casual. In the days leading up to it, Karen ramped up her campaign. She printed flyers, distributing them door to door, painting me as a dangerous neighbor who used farm equipment to intimidate residents. She even managed to convince a few of the more timid homeowners to sign a petition for my removal. The thing about power, though, is that it blinds people. Karen was so focused on punishing me that she didn't notice how others were starting to question her authority. By chapter 2 of this war, she'd made a mistake. She'd overplayed her hand. People began whispering, this time, not about me, but about her. They were tired of her rules, her endless fines, her obsession with control. The HOA board, too, started feeling the pressure. After all, nothing spreads faster in a small neighborhood than discontent. The day of the hearing arrived with a chill in the air. The sky was overcast, heavy with the promise of rain. I parked my truck in front of the clubhouse, walked inside, and took a seat across from the board. Karen sat at the center, dressed like she was attending a courtroom trial. Her binder stacked high with documents and photos. Most of them, I assumed, of my property. I stayed calm. The board began reading through her list of accusations, each one more exaggerated than the last. But for every claim, I had proof to the contrary. Photographs, property records, even county maps showing where her SUV had been parked illegally on my land. When I slid those documents across the table, the room shifted. You could feel it. The confidence draining from her voice as the truth started to take hold. The board adjourned after 2 tense hours, saying they'd review the evidence. Karen left without a word, her face pale and tight. That night, the rain finally came. Heavy sheets of water poured down, washing away the dust from the roads. And as I stood by my window listening to the thunder roll across the sky, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Karen had lost her footing, but she wouldn't back down. Not yet, and I wasn't done either. Because when someone tries to bury you under rules and fines, the best revenge isn't retaliation, it's exposure. And I had just started digging. By the time the rain stopped, the air around Willow Bend Estates felt different, heavier, tense, and full of unspoken hostility. Word of the HOA hearing had spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Some claimed I had humiliated Karen in front of the board. Others whispered that I was about to be expelled from the subdivision entirely. Either way, people were watching. Every morning I could feel eyes peeking from behind curtains as I went about my chores. Karen, for her part, had gone quiet. Too quiet, the kind of silence that meant she was planning something. She stopped walking her dog past my property, stopped confronting me in person, and instead began orchestrating her revenge from behind closed doors. The HOA's website filled with new proposed addendums to existing rules, each suspiciously specific, each clearly aimed at me. No large mechanical equipment stored in residential view. All driveways must remain clear for aesthetic. Harmony. Repeated violation of community. Decorum subject to legal escalation. She was trying to legislate me out of existence, but here's the thing about people like Karen, they always leave a trail. And once you start following it, you find more than you expect. It began with a knock on my door one afternoon. It wasn't a confrontation, though. It was a delivery. An envelope left without a name. Inside was a folded stack of papers. Anonymous photocopies of HOA financial statements and meeting minutes. Most of it looked ordinary, the kind of bureaucratic fluff no one ever reads. But buried among the fine print was something interesting. A line item for Community Beautification Initiative, Maintenance Services. The payment amount was large, unusually large for such a vague description, and it was signed off personally by Karen Whitmore. That wasn't proof of anything yet, but it was enough to make me curious, so I started digging. The HOA's records were technically public to residents, though they made accessing them as tedious as possible. Still, I had patience, and a scanner. Late at night, I pored through hundreds of pages of budgets, board votes, landscaping contracts, and property assessments. The deeper I went, the clearer it became that something didn't add up. Dozens of invoices from a landscaping company that didn't seem to exist. Reimbursements for event catering for HOA meetings that never happened. And a recurring payment, monthly, for vehicle maintenance services. That one caught my attention immediately. I didn't remember any HOA-owned vehicles. The account number listed for those payments was the same as the one used for Karen's SUV registration fee. She wasn't just using HOA power to bully neighbors. She was using HOA funds, our dues, to pay for her personal expenses. The discovery filled me with equal parts fury and satisfaction. Suddenly, the entire pattern of her behavior made sense. The constant fines, the intimidation, the threats. They weren't just about control. They were a distraction. The more chaos she created, the less likely anyone was to look behind the curtain. But now I had the receipts. Literally. For the next week, I gathered everything, screenshots, documents, and old email newsletters that contradicted her reports. The evidence painted a clear picture of embezzlement, fraud, and abuse of authority. The HOA wasn't her fiefdom anymore. It was a crime scene waiting to be exposed. Still, I knew this wasn't going to be as easy as showing up with papers and declaring victory. The HOA board wasn't neutral. They were her allies. Most of them owed their positions to her manipulation, and others were too afraid to challenge her. If I wanted to take her down, I needed to do it publicly. The opportunity came faster than I expected. Karen announced an emergency community meeting to discuss ongoing violations threatening neighborhood values. The flyer appeared in every mailbox overnight. It was obvious who the violations were referring to. She was going to make an example out of me, to crush any resistance before it spread. I decided to attend. When I arrived, the clubhouse was already packed. The tension was palpable. Homeowners sat in rows of metal chairs, murmuring to one another, while Karen stood confidently at the podium. Behind her, a slideshow displayed pictures of my tractor, my driveway, and the ditch incident, each one framed like evidence in a criminal trial. She spoke with her usual righteousness, the kind that left no room for reason. Then she opened the floor for discussion. That was my cue. I stood, calm and deliberate, and approached the front. Karen tried to stop me, insisting I had no speaking privileges, but the crowd had grown restless. People wanted to hear both sides. Some of them even clapped when I refused to sit down. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I simply laid the papers down on the table in front of the board. Dozens of them, neatly organized, labeled, and dated. I described the inconsistencies, the fraudulent invoices, and the payments made to non-existent companies. Then I pointed out the vehicle. Maintenance payments that matched the registration. For Karen's SUV, the same one she'd claimed was personal property. The room fell silent, even. Her closest allies shifted uncomfortably. One board member reached for the documents and began reading them carefully. Another took out their phone, quietly snapping photos. Karen's face turned pale. She tried to interrupt, to call it slander, but the more she spoke, the less anyone believed her. The spell she had cast over the neighborhood for years was breaking right there in that room. By the end of the meeting, the board announced an internal review. Karen stormed out before they finished speaking. Her SUV screeched down the road minutes later, tires squealing as she sped home. That night, for the first time in months, the neighborhood didn't feel tense. It felt alive. People came up to me afterward, some apologetic, others grateful. They admitted they'd been too scared to speak up before, too intimidated to challenge her control. But now the truth was out, and there was no putting it back in the box. Still, I knew better than to think it was over. Karen wasn't the kind of person to go down quietly. Sure enough, within days, she began her counterattack. She started claiming I had forged documents, that I was harassing her and endangering the community. She filed a restraining order that didn't hold up in court, but forced me to waste hours dealing with it. She even had a lawyer send me a letter threatening to sue for defamation. But this time, I wasn't alone. The board had seen the documents. The residents had too, and a few of them, former accountants, business owners, and one retired attorney, had started asking questions of their own. The cracks in her empire were spreading fast. Then came the twist I didn't see coming. One morning, I received another envelope in my mailbox. No name, just a plain manila folder. Inside was a flash drive and a single note. "You'll want to see this." Curiosity got the better of me. I plugged it into my computer and opened the files. What I found there wasn't just evidence. It was the smoking gun. Videos. Recordings of HOA board Zoom meetings. Private ones. Meetings where Karen openly bragged about diverting funds for personal reimbursements. Screenshots of emails to fake companies she'd created to funnel money. And even a draft of a resignation letter she'd written months before, apparently never sent, addressed to the HOA president she'd forced out last year. Someone from inside her circle had turned against her. For the first time since the SUV incident, I realized the balance had shifted completely. She'd tried to bury me in rules, but now I had something that could bury her for good, and I was ready to use it. The flash drive sat on my desk for nearly an hour before I found the courage to open it again. The folder contained everything: emails, spreadsheets, and video recordings that painted a damning portrait of corruption and arrogance. Each file peeled back another layer of the facade Karen had built around herself, revealing the rot beneath. For years she had weaponized her position, manipulating the HOA board, silencing dissenters, and using community funds like her personal checking account. The first video I watched was a recorded Zoom call, time-stamped nearly a year before our feud began. In it, Karen spoke casually about reimbursing herself for administrative costs, though the amounts she mentioned were thousands of dollars, far beyond anything legitimate. Another recording showed her coaching a board member on how to adjust votes in the meeting minutes so she could push through her own rule changes uncontested. The evidence was overwhelming, and whoever had sent me this flash drive clearly wanted me to use it. For the first time, I understood that this wasn't just about me and my tractor. This was about every homeowner she had bullied, fined, and intimidated into submission. Every family who had packed up and left because she made their lives miserable. Karen wasn't just a neighborhood nuisance. She was a tyrant in yoga pants, ruling over a suburban kingdom built on fear. That realization filled me with a quiet determination. It was time to end this once and for all, but I also knew better than to confront her head-on again. If there was one thing Karen was skilled at, it was twisting reality to make herself look like the victim. She'd done it for years, and she'd do it again if I gave her the chance. No, this time I needed to be strategic. So I started building a case. I organized every piece of evidence: the HOA records, the emails, the photos, the financial discrepancies, and now the recordings. I created a timeline of her actions, tracing each misuse of funds back to her personal accounts. The more I compiled, the more her crimes came into focus. By the end of the week, I had a binder thick enough to make a lawyer blush. Then, I reached out to the county housing authority. HOAs weren't above the law, and the misuse of resident funds was a serious matter. The investigator I spoke to listened carefully, asked for copies of the evidence, and assured me they'd open a formal inquiry. While the legal process churned quietly in the background, life in Willow Bend Estates began to shift. Karen's absence was noticeable. She stopped appearing at HOA meetings. Her SUV no longer paraded up and down the cul-de-sac like a chariot of authority. Even her infamous clipboard, her weapon of choice, was nowhere to be seen. Rumors spread quickly. Some said she was taking time off for personal reasons. Others whispered that she'd been caught in some kind of scandal. No one knew for sure, but everyone sensed the walls closing in. I kept to myself, watching it unfold from a distance. The tension that had once clung to the neighborhood was beginning to dissolve, replaced by cautious optimism. Neighbors started speaking to one another again. People I'd barely exchanged words with in years would stop by, offering kind smiles or subtle nods of approval. Then, one afternoon, a letter arrived in every mailbox in the neighborhood. It was printed on plain white paper, not HOA letterhead, and addressed simply to residents of Willow Bend Estates. The letter was short, but its impact was seismic. It announced that Karen Whitmore had been suspended from her role as HOA president pending an external investigation into financial irregularities. It also stated that interim leadership would be appointed immediately. That same evening, an emergency meeting was held in the clubhouse. The turnout was unlike anything the HOA had ever seen. Dozens of residents packed into the small hall, buzzing with anticipation. For years, Karen had ruled over them with an iron fist, but now they were finally free to speak without fear of retaliation. The interim president, a soft-spoken retired teacher named Ms. Ellis, addressed the crowd. She confirmed what many suspected. The county had launched a formal audit into the HOA's finances. Preliminary findings showed substantial evidence of embezzlement, misappropriation of funds, and falsified documentation. It was exactly what the flash drive had revealed. For a moment, the room was silent. Then the murmurs began. Low, incredulous, almost relieved. Karen had fallen, and everyone could feel it. But even in her downfall, she wasn't done causing chaos. A few days later, early on a foggy morning, I was jolted awake by the sound of heavy tires crunching gravel. I looked out the window and saw Karen's black SUV creeping up the street. It stopped at the edge of my property, headlights off. For several minutes, it just sat there, idling. When she finally stepped out, she looked nothing like the woman who once strutted through the neighborhood enforcing her will. Her hair was disheveled, her face drawn, her expression a mix of rage and desperation. She walked up to the edge of my driveway, the same place where she'd once blocked me in, and stood there, staring at the ditch. Then she looked at my tractor, parked neatly beside the barn, as if daring it to defy her again. She didn't say a word. She just turned around, climbed back into her SUV, and drove off into the mist. That was the last time I saw her. In the weeks that followed, everything unraveled for her. The county audit confirmed what my evidence had suggested. She had embezzled tens of thousands of dollars from HOA funds, funneling the money through fake contracts and personal reimbursements. The story made the local news. The HOA dissolved its current board entirely, forming a new one under direct county oversight. Karen's name became synonymous with everything wrong about HOAs: greed, power, and control taken too far. And as for me, life finally went quiet again. The fines stopped. The emails stopped. The endless nitpicking about grass length and mailbox colors stopped. But more importantly, the neighborhood began to heal. People started helping each other again. Lawns didn't have to look perfect. They just had to feel like home. The constant fear of judgment faded away, replaced by laughter, cookouts, and the simple peace that comes from living without someone breathing down your neck about aesthetic violations. Sometimes, I'd stand in my driveway, the same spot where it had all started, and look out over the quiet street. The birds sang again. The air smelled clean. My tractor, red and proud, gleamed in the sunlight. It wasn't just a machine anymore. It was a symbol, a reminder that sometimes standing up for yourself doesn't mean shouting or fighting. Sometimes it means doing the right thing, even when it's hard. Karen had tried to bury me under her rules, but in the end, it was her greed that buried her instead. And though the neighborhood would never be exactly the same, one thing was certain. Willow Bend Estates would never forget the day the queen of the HOA finally fell. But as peace settled over the community, a small nagging thought remained in the back of my mind, because sometimes, when you pull the weeds out of a garden, the roots run deeper than you think, and in the quiet corners of the HOA's new leadership, something else was beginning to stir. For a while, peace actually held in Willow Bend Estates. It was strange at first. After months of tension, arguments, and petty wars, the silence felt almost unnatural. No more notes taped to doors, no more surprise inspections, and no more endless fines for unsightly lawn conditions. The new board, under Ms. Ellis, focused on rebuilding trust and transparency. They even held open meetings where residents could finally speak their minds without fear of reprisal. For most of us, it felt like a fresh start, but peace in neighborhoods like this never lasts forever. About 2 months after Karen's fall, strange things began happening again. Small at first, almost unnoticeable. A few neighbors started receiving warnings in their mailboxes about minor infractions that didn't make sense. One notice accused the marshals of violating a noise ordinance because their kids were playing basketball in their driveway. Another claimed that a resident's front door color was out of community compliance, even though it matched the approved palette. At first, Ms. Ellis dismissed these letters as leftovers, old forms that Karen had issued before her removal. But the dates on the warnings were recent, and the signatures at the bottom didn't match anyone currently on the board. It didn't take long before people started whispering that Karen still had allies. When she was in power, Karen had surrounded herself with a loyal circle, a handful of neighbors who benefited from her influence. They got leniency on their own violations, inside information on property decisions, and early access to neighborhood contracts. Even after her suspension, those people kept to themselves, avoiding meetings and staying suspiciously quiet. It wasn't long before someone coined a name for them: the Shadow HOA. At first it sounded like gossip, but as the weeks passed, it became clear something was happening behind the scenes. Residents began receiving anonymous emails from the Neighborhood Integrity Committee, warning of a decline in community standards and threatening new enforcement actions. No one knew who was behind them, but everyone suspected the same thing: Karen hadn't truly disappeared. Then one morning, I found something in my mailbox that confirmed it. A plain envelope. No return address. Inside, a single sheet of paper. It was a notice of violation. The reason? Improper storage of agricultural equipment visible from roadway. The exact same rule Karen had tried to use against me months earlier. But the letter wasn't from the official HOA. It bore no official header, no signature from the new board, just a typed note and a small watermark at the bottom. A faint outline of a crown. Karen's old symbol. The Queen was back. I brought the letter to Ms. Ellis immediately. She was just as stunned as I was. It wasn't from her office, and it wasn't part of any active case. She promised to look into it, but even she looked uneasy. The HOA's email server had been breached a few times recently. Someone had been sending messages under her name. Whoever it was had access to old files, records, and addresses. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of that faint crown burned in my mind. Karen had always been meticulous. She wouldn't just disappear quietly. Maybe she had friends on the old board who still had copies of the HOA's documents. Maybe she was orchestrating everything from afar, trying to claw back her influence one letter at a time. Over the next few days, the harassment escalated. Trash bins were tipped over in front of houses that had supported me during the feud. Fence panels were mysteriously damaged. Someone even poured bleach on the marshal's lawn, leaving a patchy white scar across their grass. It wasn't random vandalism, it was targeted, and everyone knew who was behind it, even if we couldn't prove it. The turning point came when a resident, Mr. Patel, installed a security camera after his mailbox was vandalized. 2 nights later, his camera caught a grainy figure creeping along the street around midnight, stuffing envelopes into mailboxes. The figure wore a hoodie, but even in the low light the shape of the SUV parked nearby was unmistakable. Sleek, black, and polished. Karen's SUV. It was impossible. She had supposedly sold it after the investigation to pay legal fees. Yet there it was, prowling the streets of Willow Bend again like a ghost. The video spread through the neighborhood chat groups like wildfire. The reaction was immediate. Residents were terrified, but also furious. For years, Karen had manipulated and bullied them, and now she was haunting them even after her downfall. The new board filed a police report, but without a clear image or license plate, the authorities could only monitor the situation. Still, the damage was done. Fear crept back into the neighborhood. Some residents began putting up "for sale" signs again, not willing to deal with another round of HOA warfare. I wasn't about to let that happen, so I did what I always did best. Worked quietly, methodically, and with purpose. I spent several nights reviewing the flash drive I'd received before. Buried deep in one of the folders, I found something I hadn't noticed before. An archived email thread labeled "Private Continuity Plan." The messages were between Karen and 2 of her old board members. They discussed forming a residential preservation group in case leadership changes. The emails detailed everything: the plan to print unofficial notices, the strategy for controlling communication channels, even the use of symbolic watermarks to maintain authority presence. It was the blueprint for the shadow HOA. Now I had them. The next morning, I forwarded the emails to the County Housing Authority investigator who had handled the original case. Within hours, I got a response. The evidence was enough to reopen the investigation and potentially pursue harassment and fraud charges. Word spread fast. Within days, 2 of Karen's old board members received subpoenas. One of them cracked almost immediately, admitting that Karen had been coordinating everything from a rented house 1 town over. She'd kept the SUV under a relative's name, used prepaid phones, and continued operating under the belief that she could restore order to Willow Bend Estates. But her delusion came crashing down when the police finally caught her. She'd been spotted at 3 a.m., stuffing envelopes into mailboxes. Again. This time, a patrol car happened to turn down the street. When the officers confronted her, she tried to flee, but her SUV got stuck in a patch of mud near the community pond. Poetic justice, I thought, when I heard the news. She'd started this war by blocking my driveway, and she ended it by trapping herself in a ditch. The arrest made headlines across the county. Former HOA president arrested for harassment and fraud. It was the final chapter of her reign of terror, and for the first time, the neighborhood could truly breathe again. But as I stood outside that morning, watching the sun rise over the cul-de-sac, I couldn't help but notice something odd. The mailbox that had once carried Karen's signature warnings was still there, gleaming, polished, untouched. And for the first time in months, I realized it wasn't empty. Inside, sitting neatly against the back wall, was another envelope. No address, no return name, just a watermark, faint and familiar. The Crown. The day after Karen's arrest, the neighborhood buzzed with a strange mix of relief and unease. For months, we had all lived under the shadow of her control. First through official HOA power, then through manipulation, and finally through the underground chaos of the shadow HOA. But even with her behind bars, there was a lingering sense that her influence hadn't fully died. It was as though the air in Willow Bend Estates still carried her presence, like a faint echo of her rules and threats. When I pulled that final envelope from my mailbox, the one marked only by the faint crown watermark, I felt that same chill I'd felt the first time she ever confronted me about my tractor. It was crisp, heavy paper, folded neatly, deliberately. Whoever had placed it there wanted me to find it. I brought it inside, set it on the kitchen table, and stared at it for a long time. Part of me wanted to throw it away without reading it. I'd been through enough. But curiosity, or maybe instinct, told me to open it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No words, just a printed photograph. It was a picture of my driveway, taken recently. In the photo, you could see my tractor parked beside the barn, the gravel glistening after a light rain. But in the corner, almost hidden in the shadows near the edge of the frame, was a familiar shape, the front end of an SUV. I set the paper down slowly, every hair on my arm standing on end. Karen's SUV had been impounded. There was no way it could be hers, unless someone else had taken up her cause. For the next few days, I stayed alert. Every sound outside seemed louder. Every passing car made me glance out the window. The neighborhood was calm during the day, but at night the silence carried weight. I started noticing tire tracks along the edge of my property. Fresh ones, cutting through the dew-covered grass in the mornings. They weren't from my tractor or truck. Someone was circling the property after dark. It was clear that while Karen herself was gone, the seeds she'd planted had taken root. There were still people out there who believed in her twisted vision of order. On the third night, just after midnight, I heard the sound of an engine idling outside. Slow, low, deliberate. I peered through the blinds, and there it was. A black SUV, headlights dimmed, sitting at the edge of my driveway. I didn't move. I just watched. The vehicle stayed there for nearly 5 minutes, its engine humming quietly. Then, without warning, it crept forward, halfway into my drive, before stopping again. Whoever was inside was making a statement, just like Karen had done all those months ago. A challenge. By the time I stepped outside, the SUV had already reversed down the road and disappeared into the darkness. The next morning, I checked the security cameras I'd installed after everything that happened. The footage showed the SUV in full view this time, but the license plate was gone, removed or covered. The driver wore a hood, face obscured. Enough was enough. I called the police again, and while they took my statement seriously, there wasn't much they could do without a clear suspect. They promised extra patrols, but I knew better. If this was another one of Karen's followers, or even someone trying to carry on her legacy, they wouldn't stop until they made their point. That evening, I took matters into my own hands. I parked my tractor at the edge of the driveway, right where it had been the day I flipped Karen's SUV. The machine was spotless, gleaming red against the fading sunlight. I made sure it was visible from the street, a silent warning that I wasn't going to be intimidated. Then, I waited. Hours passed. The streetlights flickered on. The neighborhood settled into its nightly rhythm. The distant hum of air conditioners, the chirping of crickets, the occasional bark of a dog. Midnight came and went, and I started to think maybe I'd overreacted. But just as I began to head inside, I heard it again. The low growl of an engine. The same black SUV rolled slowly into view, stopping dead center in front of my property. This time, it didn't hesitate. It pulled directly into my driveway, blocking the entrance completely. My fists clenched as I watched from the porch. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the driver's door opened. A tall man stepped out, someone I recognized faintly. He was one of Karen's old allies, a board member who had defended her even after the fraud was exposed. He looked around the property, eyes sweeping across the tractor, the barn, the house. He wasn't there to talk. He was there to provoke. Without a word, he turned and walked back to the SUV, crossing his arms as if daring me to react. And in that instant, it hit me. This wasn't just about Karen anymore. This was about the idea of control. The HOA had always thrived on it, feeding off power and intimidation. Even with her gone, there were still people addicted to that feeling of superiority. So I did exactly what I had done before. I climbed into my tractor. The machine came to life with a deep, steady roar. The headlights cut through the night, washing over the SUV like a floodlight. The man froze, caught in the glare. I moved the tractor forward slowly, deliberate, letting the front loader rise just enough to make my intention clear. He started shouting something, words I couldn't hear or didn't care to. Then, realizing I wasn't bluffing, he scrambled back into his vehicle. The SUV reversed fast, tires spitting gravel as it backed out into the road. He sped away, vanishing into the night, leaving behind nothing but tire marks and silence. When the police arrived 20 minutes later, they found the footage clear as day, between the license plate, the timestamp, and the prior incidents. There was enough to charge him with trespassing and harassment. That was the final nail in the coffin for what remained of Karen's influence. The Shadow HOA disbanded within weeks. The community formally dissolved the old bylaw system, replacing it with a volunteer neighborhood council. People started planting flowers again, repainting fences and reclaiming their homes without fear. And me? I went back to my quiet life. I fixed fences, cut grass, and sometimes, when the evenings were still, I'd sit out by the barn and listen to the wind rustling through the trees. The air finally felt light again. Every so often, I'd catch myself looking at that same ditch where it all started, the spot where I'd flipped Karen's SUV. The grass had grown back, green and soft, but the ground still bore the faint outline of the tire ruts, a reminder of what happens when arrogance meets resistance. The story of Karen became local legend. Neighbors told it to newcomers like a cautionary tale, about power, pride, and how far one person could go to control others. Some even laughed about it, calling it the Great Tractor Justice. But I never laughed, because for me it wasn't just a story. It was a lesson. You can follow every rule, pay every due, and mow every inch of your lawn to perfection. But the moment someone decides that control matters more than community, the whole foundation cracks. And when it does, sometimes all it takes to set things right again is a tractor and a man who refuses to be bullied.